This video presents what I find to be the 5 most important things to know about the Gospel of Mark. This format is a format that we will regularly utilize for other material in this class, and particularly when introducing other New Testament texts. So you can sort of think of this as a supplement to, but also working in conjunction with your reading from the textbook from this week. That you're going to get some information about biblical texts in the textbook, and you're also going to get information about the biblical texts in these top 5 videos as well. So what we'll do is, in a good top 5 fashion, we'll move from 5 down to 1. So, starting with number 5, the 5th most important thing to know about the Gospel of Mark is that the Gospel of Mark is traditionally symbolized by a lion. And these traditional symbols are going to serve as a way for us to sort of think about and remember key distinctive features of each one of the 4 synoptic or each one of the 4 canonical Gospels. So if you remember back to last week, we talked about the idea of having a number of different portraits in order to more fully capture a person. That having different accounts of a person's life or different pictures of a person can get at different aspects of that person's life, and that when we take different portraits and sort of try and smush them together into one composite portrait, that it actually obscures more about that person than it does reveal things about that person. And the argument that many Christians have made throughout the ages, beginning in the early church, was that the same thing is true for Jesus, that having multiple Gospels gives us a fuller understanding of who Jesus was and is. And so these 4 different images, the traditional images of the different Gospels, or of Jesus in the different Gospels, comes from a passage in Ezekiel 1, verses 4 through 10, where Ezekiel has this vision where there are figures resembling 4 different living creatures. One is the face of a man. So here we have a man. This is on the Book of Kells, sort of a really ornate presentation of the 4 gospel images. One of a lion. So here is Mark, the lion, the winged lion. One as an ox. This is going to be Luke. And then one as an eagle, which is going to be John. So each one of the images take their sort of origins from this passage in Ezekiel chapter 1, and then they take the sort of identity, or the way they get identified with these 4 different figures from Ezekiel 1 is on the basis of how each gospel begins. So Matthew 1:1 begins with the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So Matthew begins with the sort of humanness of Jesus by tracing his human ancestry back to Abraham. And in the Gospel of Matthew, one of the themes that we find is Jesus is really sort of presented as this human teacher that's sort of a teacher in the line of Moses. And we'll talk more about that when we come to Matthew itself. The beginning of Mark, Mark starts with John the Baptist out in the desert proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sin. So the link that Christians made here is that just as John the Baptist is sort of out in the wilderness, loudly proclaiming, as a lion might be out in the wilderness, loudly roaring. This is the connection to the figure of the lion. And then this continues in the Gospel of Mark, or the way that this characterizes Jesus in the Gospel of Mark is Jesus sort of moves from place to place very quickly in the Gospel of Mark. This word quickly or suddenly, euthus in Greek, appears 41 times in the Gospel of Mark and only a handful of times in the other synoptic gospels, Matthew and Luke. So that Jesus is moving quickly from place to place, doing powerful deeds, just as a lion might sort of bound about, showing its power. The Gospel of Luke begins with the priestly figure Zechariah, John the Baptist's father. And so the association here is sort of oxen are sacrificial animals. Luke begins with this priestly figure who would do the sacrifice. And then Jesus in Luke himself is sort of depicted as a sacrifice in Luke's passion narrative, in the account of the death and resurrection of Jesus. That there's sort of this bend toward Jesus as sacrifice, sort of as an ox would be a sacrifice in the temple. And the Gospel of John begins with this sort of really highfalutin prologue that's just really beautiful and soars to the heights of Christology. That from the very first words of John's Gospel, Jesus is proclaimed to be God. That we have this high exalted Christology from the beginning of John, and that this continues throughout the Gospel of John with certain sayings. Jesus sort of equates himself with the Father with these I am sayings. And so this high Christology of John that starts from its very beginning with the prologue associates Jesus and John with the eagle, and the Gospel of John itself as symbolized by an eagle. And so what I want you to do here is we're going to have 2 lecture pauses in this video. This is going to be our first one. What I want you to do is pause the video here and do a 4-minute free write. So set a 4-minute timer on your phone or on your computer or whatever it might be, and just free write on this prompt. So on the importance of having 4 gospels, and then briefly describing sort of what each gospel brings to the table, either on the basis of what I've just told you about this symbolism, or based on your previous knowledge of the gospels. So now that you've done this 4-minute free write, we're going to move on to our number 4 and our top 5 on Mark. The Gospel of Mark is the first written gospel. So what we're going to move to next week, you've heard me use this phrase a number of times. I use this word synoptic a number of times. We'll talk more in depth about the synoptic gospels and what synoptic means next week. But the important point to know at this point is that Mark is the basis for the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. That Matthew and Luke are utilizing Mark's written material in the creation of their own Gospels. And Matthew and Luke are also going to contain material that is not in the Gospel of Mark. That Matthew and Luke are going to have shared material with one another, and Matthew and Luke are also going to have totally unique material only found in Matthew and only found in Luke. Whereas the Gospel of Mark, most of Mark, around 90% of Mark, is found in one or the other of these 2 synoptic gospels. And Mark is written around the year 70 CE. The dating of Mark usually comes down to Mark chapter 13, what's often called the little apocalypse in the Gospel of Mark. And there is at the beginning of this little apocalypse, Jesus has entered into Jerusalem and into the temple area, and one of his disciples is sort of marveling at the things in the temple. And Jesus says, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be one stone left upon another that will not be thrown down." So it is that particular saying that Jesus sort of predicting the destruction of the temple that we talked about in that last video that happened in the year 70 CE, by which the Gospel of Mark is dated. So as a reminder, our first Jewish temple was destroyed in 586 BCE by the Babylonians. The second Jewish temple was rebuilt once the Persians took over and allowed the Judeans to go back to Jerusalem. It was enlarged by the Hasmoneans and really made sort of spectacular by Herod the Great around the year 20 BCE. The Jewish War, which was the culmination of Jewish popular unrest that's really started with the Roman ruler Pompey and with the Herodian puppet kings, came to a head in 66 to 70 CE, where we have these Jewish revolts that the Romans sort of squashed. And it is this period, or this event in 70 CE, that scholars read those remarks in Mark 13 and wonder whether or not Mark might be referring to these events. And so there's sort of a couple of different options as to what's going on with Jesus's prediction about the buildings being destroyed and not one stone being left upon another. So the first option, and this would indicate that Mark is written after 70 CE, after the temple was destroyed, is that the author of Mark already knew of the temple's destruction, that had already happened. And Jesus' prophecy is what's called ex eventu, after the fact, that the author of the Gospel of Mark has sort of put back into Jesus's mouth the prediction of the destruction of the temple, knowing that destruction has already happened. The other option is that the Gospel of Mark is written before 70 CE, and Jesus' prophecy is a prediction. So there's a couple different ways that this might get sort of parceled out. Neither option denies the fact that Jesus actually said something like this. Because there was popular Jewish unrest, it would not at all have been crazy for Jesus to make a prediction that the temple was going to be destroyed, that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed because of the Jewish unrest and the relationship with the Roman Empire. But for option number two, it could be the fact that the author of Mark sort of saw the writing on the wall, that they're writing around the time of these popular Jewish uprisings, particularly in the years preceding the destruction of the temple, 66 to 70 CE, where there was a somewhat successful Jewish revolt, and the author of Mark sort of sees the writing out on the wall and writes this prediction of the destruction onto Jesus's mouth, or into Jesus's mouth, saying Jesus makes this prediction via Mark's writing because he sees or suspects that something's going to happen in Jerusalem, that the political tensions are going to come to a head. So that's one option. Or the other option is that it's sort of a true prediction on the account of Jesus and or Mark, that it's sort of prophecy classically perceived. And both of those ways of parceling out, option number two would have the gospel written before 70 CE, before the temple is actually destroyed. So, number three here, the Gospel of Mark is better experienced in its entirety in one sitting rather than piecemeal. So one of the things I'm asking you to do for this week is sit down and read the Gospel of Mark in one sitting, sort of as you would a novel or a short story. This will probably take you about an hour and a half to 2 hours. You may have already done this at this point. But what you should find is that different things really sort of come out, different themes, different repetitions, sort of are revealed to you as you sit and hear or read the Gospel of Mark in one sitting. And this is sort of a better reflection of how the gospel probably would have been experienced by most people in the ancient world. And it actually would probably not have been primarily a private reading event wherein a person sat down with their own personal copy of the Gospel of Mark and read it on their own, because orality and literacy looked so different in the ancient world than it did today. So whereas we sort of assume that all people are literate in our context, this was not necessarily the case in the ancient world. There's a lot of debate about how many people were literate and how many people, could just sit down and read a text on their own, or even what the availability of a given text was. But those debates, no matter where someone lands on them, the conclusion to be drawn is that ancient literacy was certainly much lower than modern literacy. And so that for particularly a movement that was popular amongst the middle to lower classes, as the Jesus movement and early Christianity was, most likely the experience of the Gospel of Mark was more in sort of an oral telling, a reading or a performance of the gospel. So this is intimated not only from these literacy rates, but also by some comments that early Christians say about the value of the spoken word. So we have this quote from Papias that often gets sort of trotted out as evidence that that there's sort of a special value to the spoken word, and particularly special value of witnesses from the evangelist. So Papias says, and this is embedded, so Papias is a 2nd century figure writing around the year 130, in the 130s, but is contained later in Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, which is in the 4th dating to the 4th century CE. But Papias says, "For I did not think that what was to be gotten from the books would profit me as much as what came from the living and abiding voice." So there seems to be this sort of value to the spoken word in early Christianity that might reflect how the Gospel of Mark was experienced by early Christians. And so to kind of put this, to conclude this here, it's likely that people experienced oral tellings or performances or readings of Mark than having read it privately to themselves. And we see this sort of in some of the linguistic or stylistic features of Mark itself, that it's much shorter than Matthew and Luke. If I ask you to sit down and read Matthew and Luke in one sitting, that's a much bigger ask than reading the Gospel of Mark in one sitting. There are, in Mark, there are what are called intercalations or sandwiches, where Mark will start a story, interrupt that story with another story, and then come back to the original story. And this is really sort of a oral way of structuring a spoken narrative. We also find that Mark doesn't quote text often, and sometimes when Mark does quote text, he does so inaccurately. And stylistically, the language of Mark very much smacks of spoken narrative. That when we tell a story, we do certain things. We use "and" a lot. We use short, choppy sentences. And this happened, and then this happened, and then that happened. We also tell our stories we tend to do it quickly. So this might be Mark's use of the word "immediately" that we talked about might be a reflection of this. And then also Mark uses a lot of historic present verbs. So you might see this reflected in your translation. You might not. A historic present is when we're talking about a past event, but we're telling it as if it's happening in front of the listener's eyes. So, "and he goes and he says to me," so those are all present tense verbs. I'm sort of visualizing the action as if it's happening now and presenting it to you as if it's happening now. And we tend to do this when we speak more so than when we write. So all of this to say that historically speaking, it was probably more likely that people experienced the Gospel of Mark in an oral setting, and it is a text that is really well suited for these kind of oral settings. An oral experience of a performance in one sitting. And so me asking you to read the Gospel in one sitting is a sort of one step removed from that experience. That by experiencing in one sitting, you're doing something similar to what how the ancient or the early Christians might have experienced this gospel, but you're also doing it privately, which would have been a bit different. And if you want to, I do not assign this to you. There are some very good performances of the Gospel of Mark where you sort of can have that experience of watching the gospel in one sitting as an early Christian might. So one of these, and I've given the sort of optional reading link in the Moodle, is by Phil Rugy Jones, who is a performer of the Gospel of Mark. And the Gospel of Mark is sort of, even in modernity, has been popular as a performed text to an extent that the other Gospels have not. Number 2, the Gospel of Mark has multiple endings. So what I want you to do here is our second and final lecture pause for this video. I want you to pause and go ahead and grab a Bible, or even more than one Bible if you have more than one handy. It's kind of fun to compare and contrast. And turn to the end of the Gospel of Mark and observe and write down in your course notes what these different Bibles indicate about the various Markan endings. So most Bibles are going to indicate in different ways the originalness of the different endings of Mark. And oftentimes they'll also sort of set off these different endings in different kinds of ways, either with brackets or they'll italicize the final verses. So grab a Bible or two and turn to the ending of Mark in those Bibles and indicate how they or what they do with these various Markan endings. So what you probably found in your different Bibles is that there are usually 2 or 3 different endings that are highlighted in English translations or in English Bibles. And this is actually to sort of simplify the situation. There are more than 3 different endings, and they sort of change based on different manuscript traditions. If you take the Greek exegesis class, next semester, we'll learn more about the practice of textual criticism, comparing different manuscripts. And so this is an issue largely of textual criticism, of what different ancient manuscripts contain with respect to a certain text. And so what happened is, because Mark 16:8 ends so abruptly, it ends with the women fleeing because they're afraid after the angel tells them to report back to Peter that Jesus has gone ahead to Galilee and that he's going to meet them there. The women say nothing to no one because they were afraid, which seems like a really, really sort of unsatisfying ending. We don't get sort of the full resurrection appearances that we do in the other Gospels, and this led people early on to sort of append new endings to the Gospel of Mark. And I'll let you be the judge of whether that ending to Mark is satisfying. There's sort of different theories about what that ending is doing, whether it's meant to be a cliffhanger or whether, a section of the Gospel got lost or something like this. But the result is that early on, endings were added to the Gospel of Mark. So that our original ending is at Mark 16:8. There's a shorter ending that has Mark 16:8, this phrase about the women not saying anything to anyone because they were afraid, but then 2 additional sentences sort of clarifying what happened afterwards. And then the longer ending of Mark 16:9 through 20, which famously contains the bit about handling snakes. So this is a text that has been used in many Appalachian churches that are these sort of snake handling churches. So here we have our original ending at Mark 16:8. The additional 2 sentences that the women did in fact report everything to Peter's companions. And then a summary here of the longer ending, where Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, to 2 disciples, commissions the 11 disciples, and says that those who believe will be able to do these things: drive out demons, speak in tongues, handle snakes, drink poison, and heal the sick. And then Jesus ascends and the disciples preach everywhere. So the situation is that the sort of best manuscripts, and you probably found something like this in your English translations or in your English Bibles, that says something like the best or earliest witnesses end at Mark 16:8. So it's fairly clear on the basis of that science or art of textual criticism that Mark 16:8 is the earliest manuscripts have Mark ending here. And it makes sense that other manuscripts would add more information on, because this ends in a sort of unsatisfying cliffhanger kind of way. So the common thought is that these other endings were added later on to bring conclusion to the Gospel of Mark. But it also highlights the fact that the Gospel of Mark was a little bit more open to emendation, at least at its endings. That some early Christians didn't feel like it was disingenuous to add on new endings to bring closure to the gospel. And the result is that we have at least 3 different endings to the Gospel of Mark. And our number 1 thing to know about the Gospel of Mark. Oh, here it is. The number 1 thing to know about the Gospel of Mark is that it aims to convince its audience that Jesus was the long-awaited Jewish Messiah. So here we have sort of a real reflection of our course thesis. We're going to talk about that in just a second here. But I wanted to emphasize the fact that we have diversity in ancient Judaism, and specifically with respect to Hellenism and with respect to the different empires, and particularly in this case the Roman Empire that the Judeans found themselves under. So Mark presents Jesus as a Jewish Messiah. And the word Messiah has a number of different connotations, but one of its primary connotations was one who is anointed for the task of ruling the people as a king. And so Mark presents Jesus as sort of this kingly anointed Messiah figure, but one that is totally unexpected. One that does not rule by kicking out the Romans, by establishing the Jewish kingship that had been there with the Hasmoneans, and then with its precedence back in the kingship of David. But Jesus's kingship, or Jesus's messiahship, is very, very different. And this is particularly highlighted in the disciples' misunderstanding of who Jesus is meant to be as the Messiah. So we have the central scene in Mark chapter 8, and really it becomes the central scene for the other 2 synoptic gospels as well, where Peter confesses that Jesus is the Messiah, and then immediately after this, Jesus predicts his own mocking, his own death, and his own resurrection in Mark chapter 8. And then Jesus goes on to do this 2 more times, once again in Mark chapter 9 and once again in Mark chapter 10. And the implication is that Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of Man, is a different kind of kingly figure, a kingly figure that's anointing, that Jesus is anointed for the task of messiahship, or the anointed for the task of kingship by means of his suffering, death, and resurrection. And of course, this is a central theme in early Christianity, that suffering is sort of a means of expressing one's conformity with Christ, that suffering in one way or another reflects what the leader of Christianity, namely Jesus the Christ, did in his own life, death, and resurrection. And so we really we see this idea of a suffering Messiah also in the Apostle Paul, but Mark really presents it in sort of this narrative form. So here we have this suffering. I've highlighted here the suffering, the rejected by the chief priests and the scribes, being killed and rising again. These are sort of the things that characterize Jesus as Mark's suffering Messiah. And this unique presentation of Jesus as a suffering Messiah returns us to our course thesis. And this idea that these texts in the New Testament reflect on Jesus' life, death, and resurrection and ministry in different kinds of ways. So Mark has a unique presentation about who Jesus is in his life, his sort of his life that's characterized by miracles in his ministry. But then that Jesus is the Messiah who is the suffering Messiah. And so this is very much a theological claim that Mark is presenting Jesus in a certain way, and that Mark's presentation of Jesus is theologically significant, is a theological statement that's going to be taken up by the later gospel writers as well.